Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here. I know we're 2 minutes after the hour right now, so we will get started as people come in. So I'm just going to begin with a quick intro. We're trying to shorten up the intro here, so we'll get started. So hi, everyone. My name is Robert Driver, postdoc at Duke University, and welcome to the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series here. So before we get started, just to introduce the AOS Student Research Grants. Each year, the AOS offers the AOS Student Research Grants to graduate students and early career researchers. Postdocs are eligible as well. And each year, the AOS receives many applications, making them highly competitive grants. And winners are able to advance the field of ornithology while still remaining feasible as part of a graduate dissertation within the grant budget. So the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series, which we're at right now, celebrates that challenging and innovative work of the AOS Student Research Grant recipients by sharing their work to AOS members and the public. So each week we are showcasing the research and research plans of a 2023 or 2022 AOS Student Research Grant winner in a seminar style format. And there's just 2 weeks after this week that are posted on the AOS website, so you can see that information and register. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank the AOS and AOS Student Affairs Committee, including Ramona Fletcher and Chris Ann Handel, for their continued input, and especially thank Kristen, our speaker today. And before we turn our attention to Kristen's research, I want to mention to put your microphones on mute. If you have questions, you can use one of 3 methods. One is the Q&A box down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can also just enter your question in the chat like you normally would, or attendees do not have can't speak in this seminar, but if you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask the question aloud, and I will look for that and unmute you during the Q&A session at the end. So I'd like to remind everyone that this is an AOS sponsored event and that all participants are required to follow the AOS virtual meeting event code of professional conduct. And I will post a link to the AOS virtual meeting event code of professional conduct in the chat. And please be aware also that we are recording the talk. Also, I will post a link in the chat as well to a post-seminar evaluation form. We're trying to make this seminar series as great as we can, and we're doing it each week. And to improve it, please take a moment to fill out the post-seminar evaluation form. You can tell me all about how my intro is too long, things like that. And I'll also post contact information for the Student Affairs Committee through AOS. Okay, so for today, Kristen Hobbs is our speaker, and Kristen is currently a Ph.D. candidate at Kansas State University. And Kristen's academic career began with a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Wellesley College in Massachusetts. And following graduation, Kristen took what I would consider a non-traditional path towards ornithology, working for a number of careers as a research technician studying HIV. And her research on HIV produced over 10 publications in journals, such as PLOS One, PLOS Medicine, PLOS Pathogens. Some of these journal titles that I just enjoy saying, like Blood Advances and Journal of Virus Eradication. Wow. Okay, and then in 2021, Kristen joined Alice Boyle's lab at Kansas State University. In addition to her work on Corapipo, which we're going to hear about today, Kristen has worked on the grassland project portion of the Boyle lab, as well as with kestrels. And this research is published in IBIS and Animal Behavior, respectively. And in addition to Kristen's AOS Student Research Grant, which we all know about because we're here, Kristen received the Behavior Society Research Award. And notably, Kristen received honorable mention for her NSF GRFP proposal in 2021. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen for her talk entitled Climatic Influences on the Ecology and Evolution of a Tropical Lekking Bird.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for attending my talk today. Thanks, Robert, and thanks to the American Ornithological Society organizers for putting together this seminar series I was excited to hear about. And thanks for providing some of the funding that supported this research. My name is Kristen, and I'm a PhD candidate at Kansas State University working with Dr. Alice Boyle. And today I'm going to talk with you about how climate and particularly rainfall influence two species of fruit-eating tropical birds. So I changed the title on you to tropical lekking frugivores because I had a couple of them to talk about. So on the left we have the white-ruffed manakin, and on the right we have the white-collared manakin, both adult males. So it's well known across bird species that climatic drivers have an influence on behavioral ecology. For example, we know that birds' migratory and foraging behaviors can be influenced by barometric pressure, and reproduction and other life history traits can be influenced by temperature, with species employing strategies such as fat storage, heterothermy, or even torpor to save energy in times of food scarcity or migration. Rare events such as storms or disturbances that are more common with climate change now can influence species behavior and evolution. An allostatic overload can occur in which prolonged stress can alter species responses such that they deviate away from their normal coping strategies. So before I go into details about our specific tropical birds and why we work with them, I want to remind you of a concept with which we're all familiar. This is the concept of thermal niches, or the idea that species have specific thermal ranges at which they perform best or have the highest fitness. As you can see on the left, there's an image with 3 species that each have a mean temperature Celsius that works best for them, where their performance is highest at the peak corresponding to that mean temperature. So extending this to birds, we know that the thermal niche of a roadrunner is probably different than that of a ptarmigan or a trogon. But we're also familiar with another abiotic stressor, which is precipitation. We know birds are affected by rain, but we don't know much about how or why. And over the course of many years, there's been surprisingly little theory dedicated to the question of how and when organisms are affected by rain. So for a long time, we didn't even have a framework for making predictions about the effects of precipitation. But just a few years ago, a paper came out discussing Hygric niche theory, a new model for understanding the effects of rain on endotherms, which are animals that can generate heat internally like birds and like us. The Hygric niche is the idea that there's an optimal range of conditions for a species, where they're expected to exhibit peak performance in the middle of the range of precipitation conditions they can tolerate. So you can see here that there's a peak of highest individual performance, much like the thermal niches, and the peak levels off at two extremes that are drier and wetter. So the roadrunner we were talking about might have a peak settling further to the left of this image, closer to the orange area. So if we imagine the Hygric niche of macaws, we might find some in the drier end of their niche flying across the desert, some in the wetter end who are in practically flooded conditions, and some in the middle of their range of conditions they can tolerate that are at their Goldilocks or sweet spot. For populations at the dry end of their niche, like this macaw in the desert, we have certain demographic predictions related to the Hygric niche. On the y-axis here, we have demographic rates, so birth and death rates, and on the x-axis, we see mean conditions from driest to wettest. For this guy already experiencing the dry end of his niche, we will see decreased demographic rates or negative responses during dry years, and increased demographic success during wetter years when he's getting closer to his niche peak. But the opposite should also be true. If you take a population like the macaw that lives in very wet conditions, then in wetter years, demographic rates will be decreased. It's too much rain. And survival and things will actually increase during drier years when the macaws are closer to the mean conditions at the center of their niche peak. So many of us are familiar with the concept of having not enough rain, but Hygric niche theory also emphasizes the somewhat surprising point that in the tropics, there might be such a thing as too much rain. What we don't understand is what mechanisms underlie this effect of too much rain. What mechanisms underlie this negative slope where situations of high precipitation can mean lower demographic rates? So we can consider the answer to this question by thinking back to first principles. First of all, humidity in rainy environments can cause problems. Humid air has a higher heat capacity than dry air, meaning it can absorb more heat before changing temperature. So humid air absorbs more heat from surfaces, for example, sucking it off the bodies of birds. In addition, birds might get condensation under their contour feathers when it's humid, reducing their capacity for insulation. So we talk about this in our lab as a raincoat problem. If you have good waterproofing in a raincoat, you're often waterproofed but wet from condensation. So the costs of getting wet, as this bird can tell you, are perhaps even more obvious than the costs of high humidity. When birds are wetted, their insulation layer, so their main tool for thermoregulation, is damaged, and they can have a greater than 50% loss of their insulative capacity. So think of this as wearing a down coat that then gets soaked. You just don't have any fluff to keep you warm. Many of us are familiar with this example in the context of mist netting, where we worry about rain because we don't want to damage a bird's coat that it uses for that insulation. Another point of Hygric niche theory is that the effect of rain should depend on elevation. This is because temperature decreases with increasing elevation, about 10 degrees Celsius per 1,000 meters, and energetic responses depend on temperature. So at higher elevations or cooler temperatures, thermogenic costs will be higher. And thermogenic costs are higher when organisms are cool and wet than when they are warm and wet. It's harder to maintain homeothermy, or a stable body temperature, when you're wet. So you can imagine if you were hiking at low elevation versus at middle elevations, how much more miserable it would be if you got rained on at higher elevations. So in today's talk, I'll lead you through my investigations of how rainfall affects rainforest birds, who people sometimes expect will be used to high amounts of precipitation, such that many people expect it doesn't necessarily bother them. We're going to explore the idea that there is still such thing as too much rain for individuals, populations, and species. We'll first start at the level of the individual with a more proximate lens, learning about how rain interacts with elevation to affect white-collared manakin display behavior. Next, we'll address the effects of rain at the population level, learning about how white-ruffed manakin males make altitudinal migratory decisions when they're navigating trade-offs in terms of survival and reproduction. And finally, I'll explain a study in progress that will help us understand how climate influences reproductive skew across over a dozen populations of white-ruffed manakins in Costa Rica and Panama. To start off with, I want to introduce you to a widespread and fantastic family known as manakins that you may have heard of before. Manakins are a group of about 50 species of birds distributed throughout Central and South America, and they are known for males performing extreme displays for females on various substrates like cleared ground arenas, saplings, or display logs, depending on the species. Females visit males' display courts to shop for mates, and they only benefit from the interaction in that they obtain sperm, so genes, and an epic display from the male. They receive no food, parental, or territory assistance from that brief copulation and interaction. And females tend to shop around and choose a few specific males every year in the population, leading to strong reproductive skew or variance in reproductive success between males, with some males who are much more popular than others. So for reference, the bird in the top left is the white-collared manakin male. The top right is the white-ruffed manakin male. These are the two we're talking about today. And they're both displaying solo. And the ones coming out of Paraguay there are just an example of blue manakins who are displaying cooperatively. There are several reasons why we study manakins in relation to rainfall, and it's not just because they're so adorable and have these amazing displays. They're relatively small, being the size of different sparrows depending on the species, and this means we are likely to see responses to climate because of their increased surface area and corresponding temperature sensitivity. They're frugivorous, meaning they subsist almost completely on fruit, which can create some energetic challenges we'll talk about later. Finally, their sexually selected tendency means we can investigate the intersection between different forms of selection, like natural and sexual selection. So for the first question I introduced, we will again be starting at the level of individual behaviors in rain and white-collared manakins. We'll be trying to learn about how rain and elevation interact to influence display behavior. So again, this is a white-collared manakin male doing a little bit of throat flagging. And for this chapter of my dissertation, I studied white-collared manakins at middle and lower elevations in Costa Rica. We predicted that white-collared manakins would cease their courtship displays in rain, that we would see a reasonable number of displays in dry conditions during the non-breeding season, but that these displays would actually decrease if rain was falling on the birds, as it tends to do in the non-breeding season. We also predicted that we would see differences in display behavior in the rain depending on elevation, in other words, an interaction between rain and elevation. You can see here that the x-axis is millimeters of rainfall per hour, and the dependent variable y is displays per hour, and we see a decrease in display behavior in low elevation, the dashed green line. But we anticipate a steeper decrease in display behavior at mid-elevation, as indicated by the solid blue line. As we discussed, it's harder to thermoregulate when cold and wet than when warm and wet, so we anticipated that display would drop off more quickly at middle elevations as compared to low elevations. To determine the amount of display occurring, we relied on these birds' loud, distinctive sounds called snap jumps and roll snaps. The snap is like snapping your fingers together loudly or popcorn popping, and the roll snap is a motor-like sound, and they make both by snapping their wings behind their back like this. I'll show you an example in a minute. So for their display, they have a cleared display court with leaves removed from the ground, and they will jump between saplings around that cleared arena, making those snapping sounds as they go. So in this video, you can see the cleared display court towards the right side on the ground, And you'll see a few snaps and a little bit of a roll snap, but mostly just snap jumps to give you an idea of this display behavior. So that kind of gives you an idea of how we were able to quantify their sounds. We were able to put out audio recording devices. So at each of the display courts I found at low and middle elevations, I was able to mount a recording device in a box on a PVC pipe set up under an umbrella to absorb some of the rain sound through the foam so it didn't just make noise on a Tupperware. I also had 2 camouflaged rain gauges for tracking the amount of rain that fell during a given recording. My assistant Miriam and I performed behavioral observations at each of the display courts so that we could learn how loud the manakin sounds at each of the focal display courts were relative to their surroundings and relative to other courts nearby. This way we were able to establish a cutoff volume for each of our focal males performing at each of their own display courts. During July and August of 2022, the non-breeding season for manakins, I put together this setup at 5 display courts at mid-elevation and 8 display courts at low elevation in Costa Rica. And following the field season, I quantified the number of roll snaps and snap jumps using the sound analysis software Raven Pro, using the sound thresholds we had established at each of the 13 display courts. I did this for about 711 hours of audio recordings, each 2 to 3 hours long, and in total I had about 300 recordings. I used the rain gauge data to determine rainfall rate per hour, and I summed together roll snaps and snap jumps per hour to get a display rate, just summing them and weighing them equally per hour. So let's remember what we're looking for here. We're wondering if we see evidence that display behavior changes based on rainfall, and we're wondering if we see different responses to rainfall depending on elevation. Our first finding was that 30% fewer displays are performed when it's not raining, even when you take into account the start time and the different display courts. This is a somewhat unsurprising result, but one that needed to be tested. It gives us an indication of the choices these birds are making, which we presume is a behavioral choice due to anticipated physiological stress of displaying in the rain. For our second prediction, the model showed that the displays per hour declined much more steeply at mid-elevation, shown here in blue, than at low elevation, shown as a dashed green line, which is what we expected. But looking at how the raw values map onto the predicted values gives us more context. Here you can see the predicted values as lines again and the raw values as dots. You can see that a really important part of this shallow slope for low elevation happens to be this bird who displayed quite a lot in pretty heavy rain at low elevation. I looked back at my data set in case this was an error, and it was not. I remember this bird actually displaying like crazy in the rain. What's important though is to note that this event drives the interaction we see between rain and elevation, so that's pulling that green slope up. So you can see that without this particular individual's display that day, the slopes would have looked fairly similar to one another. So without his behavior, there's no apparent interaction between elevation and rain. So I was puzzled by this, and I want to invite you to think about a few different considerations. You could make the argument that this interaction effect wouldn't exist in a repeat study on the basis of this particular male who was just being weird relative to other males. He really displayed a lot in the rain that time and day. But we know that the data point is real and the behavior was real, and it did happen at low elevation. So could it be that his behavior was possible because he was at a lower elevation where more display would be tolerable, whereas this just wouldn't have ever occurred at middle elevation? So I took this analysis as far as I could using frequentist statistics, but I often found that models were failing to converge if I incorporated things that I thought were important to the model, such as start times and random effects for different courts. So I'm currently analyzing this data set with a hierarchical Bayesian model that accounts for zero inflation, making some different assumptions to see if that tells us more about what kind of inference we can make. So with those results in mind, the mechanism suggested by this study is that we might be seeing behavioral avoidance of rain due to the physiological costs of wetting, and this behavioral avoidance might be more extreme at higher elevations. We think this might explain some of the breeding season phenology we see in these manakins. Presumably energetically expensive display behaviors such as breeding display and breeding itself are concentrated during the dry season for a reason perhaps, while less activity occurs during the rainy seasons. Our knowledge that rain decreases display behavior and may be particularly challenging at higher elevations is relevant to my next chapter, which has to do with how white-ruffed manakin males make altitudinal migratory decisions. White-ruffed manakin males make different decisions each year about whether to migrate downhill, since they're navigating a trade-off between survival and reproduction. Again, this is a white-ruffed manakin male, and these are the guys we'll be focusing on for the last 2/3 of my talk today. We wanted to learn about how white-ruffed manakins make altitudinal migratory decisions, based on theory of how animals make life history decisions in general. So white-ruffed manakins are great for studying life history decisions because they have survival reasons to migrate downhill, but reproductive reasons to stay at middle elevations. Although they have different reasons to migrate or not migrate, all individuals make different decisions each year, which makes them a great species for studying these trade-offs. So here you can see a green female on the left and an adult male on the right. This study was performed in Costa Rica as well, nearby but years earlier, at Rara Avis and Selvatica reserves. So during the dry season, white-ruffed manakins breed at middle elevations on groomed display logs. They do these aerobatic maneuvers that I've just indicated with a bounce on a log, but I'm going to flesh it out in some more detail here with some cartoons and a video. To perform their display, males will work together at times to engage in butterfly flights around the female, who is watching on a display log. So they have these undulating up and down flights like this cartoon shows, with a funny upright posture that seems like it involves doing something that you wouldn't normally do when you're flying. And there's a mixture of this performance with a high-speed canopy dive and a flip over the female involving a vocal and mechanical sound called the flap chi-wah. So in the video I'm about to show, you'll see a male white-ruffed manakin, an adult, waiting on the log, while another one practices over him. So you'll see the male waiting on the log, and then you'll see a male come down, shooting out of the sky really fast, and he'll do a practice dive and a flap chi-wah over the other male. And then they go into butterfly flights, doing this undulating up and down move. So the flap chi-wah itself is going to be very fast, and I don't have high-speed video for you this time, so keep your eyes peeled. Now you can see that butterfly flight, which I think is like a Dr. Seuss character going up and down. So the point here is not just these two moves, which we'll mention later in quantification, but there are a lot of moves that we believe are energetically intense, and males vary a lot in their performance of these displays. But some of these guys will perform nearly constantly throughout the day for months at a time. So we believe it wears some of them out. It's important to note that not only some of these males are given year are successful. One male will be really popular with females, while other males get no mates or just a few mates. So on the left, we see a very successful male, while the ones on the right are much less successful at siring offspring, although obviously one of these guys is having a little more luck than the other. And it's also important to remember that rain is a mortality risk for these birds, who are reliant on foraging for fruit during many hours of the day to keep their energy up. So long and heavy rainstorms of the non-breeding season can lead to limited foraging opportunities, and males can actually starve. During the rainy non-breeding season, some individuals choose to migrate downhill because of that storm risk. The benefit of this downhill migration is an increased chance of survival, especially if you're small and skinny, which many of our adult males are. However, migrating downhill to survive, as many birds do, comes at a reproductive cost. Males lose popularity this season after they've migrated, so the migratory males are less likely to get visits from females, which in many species is correlated with siring success. And migrant males experience a decrease in their status, often losing their display log that was their stage for displaying for females. So there's a clear trade-off to navigate. Migratoriness increases survival but decreases reproductive potential. So what we were wondering is, if all males face this same trade-off, why do some males migrate while other males don't? In other words, why do individuals vary in how they navigate this trade-off? So we know from previous work I've discussed, the stuff in the white on the left, that migration affects later male success. But in this study, we wanted to learn about how display behavior might influence migratoriness. So over 6 field seasons from 2008 to 2012, Boyle Lab quantified display behavior, migratoriness using claw samples, and the ages of males captured and monitored. To determine display rates, we hid in blinds in the rainforest and performed behavioral observations during the breeding seasons. We summed rate per hour of energetically expensive elements in the display. These were flap chi-wahs, aerial flaps, and butterfly flights. And to determine migratoriness for that fall, we analyzed isotope values in claws collected during the following breeding season, which give a sense of the environment the birds were in a few months prior. So it gives us an idea of what the birds were doing and where they were in October to January. So that way we have a sense of migratoriness during the non-breeding season, which we can compare to display rate in the prior breeding season. We determined white ruff manakin ages using known molt patterns of males who exhibit delayed plumage maturation. So just like bald eagles will get their white head when they're adults, fluffy green manakins are hatchier birds. Males with a silver white ruff were born 2 years ago, and males with a little Zorro mask like this guy were born 3 years ago. Males in this glossy blue-black plumage are at least 4 years old but could be older. So if they were captured in this plumage, we had to estimate their minimum birth year. For example, an adult in definitive plumage that we caught today would have a minimum birth year of 2021, but he could have been born earlier. And young birds have practically no chance of getting to breed. An opportunity to breed really takes off when individuals are in their 4th year or older and have a real chance at gaining a display log that they command. We'll come back to this diagram later about chance of getting to breed, but for now I want to remind you of our question. Why do some males migrate while others don't? We'll talk about the population level predictions corresponding to these hypotheses. For this talk, I'll just address some predictions and results, but there's more in the paper we're working on. For our first hypothesis, we considered a few known facts and other hunches. We know decreased condition is associated with migratory tendency, and we have some concern that manakins may display so much that they wear themselves out and are in some sense forced to migrate. In this case, we expected to see a positive correlation between deuterium values and display rate. Where the birds wear themselves out displaying, they'll be more likely to migrate that fall. So if this is true, then the most migratory birds will also be the ones who displayed the most in the preceding season. On the other hand, there's a hypothesis that some individuals are able to avoid deciding between survival and reproduction because they can excel at both. I know all of us know somebody who just seems to be good at everything. And if migratories are driven by quality in this way, we expected to see the opposite effect of display rate on migratoriness to the one I just discussed. Increased display would be correlated with decreased migratoriness in the following non-breeding season, a negative relationship between isotopic values and display rate. This is because if an individual doesn't have to migrate, he's not going to want to. Males are going to want to keep their status, but these high-quality males are going to be the ones who display highly and are able to keep their status throughout the year. They'll be able to survive heavy rainstorms and display highly without making that compromise. So in this situation, the least migratory males would be the ones who displayed the most because they can do both. Finally, we thought that maybe white ruff manakins may make these critical migration decisions based on their residual reproductive value. And residual reproductive value is the remaining reproductive capacity left in an individual's life. In other words, the area under this curve, or the amount of babies you can have for the rest of your life. So note that the y-axis here is an individual's chance of getting to breed, so the area under the curve can tell us about that residual reproductive value. Again, we see different ages and chances of breeding. The young adults have more opportunity. So if you look at a 5-year-old male, he has all this significant remaining time in his life in which to breed, and he may be aware of that. He's not super stressed about maximizing his lifetime reproductive success yet because he has plenty of years left to go. However, a 9-year-old male has much less residual reproductive value remaining. And according to life history theory, the older guy would be more likely to take a risk, remaining at high elevation during storms, that could get him a reproductive reward. So we see this in other species where they will be more aggressive with other males or they'll be more aggressive with females as they get older and have little residual reproductive value left. In terms of migratory predictions, we also have some published data from the 2008 to 2009 season to consider. Young birds were somewhat likely to migrate, and birds on the cusp of gaining a log with these Zorro masks were the least likely to migrate. Adults were the most likely to migrate, but these data didn't distinguish between adults of different ages. We expected to see similar results in the young males, but we wanted to learn more about what happens in these older males from age 4 and beyond in the purple. We expected that adult males would be less likely to migrate with increasing age, simply because they'd be willing to take a survival risk in order to maximize their waning reproductive chances. So to summarize, to determine whether individual condition, intrinsic quality, or residual reproductive value drove migratoriness, we had a few population level predictions as follows. So we have these two different lines for quality and for carryover, and then we have a residual reproductive value with age. We found that neither carryover effects nor quality appeared to drive migratoriness, as you can see from this line, which is quite flat when we compare display rate to isotopic values for migratoriness. We were surprised that we didn't even see a hint in either direction in terms of either hypothesis here. And this left the residual reproductive value hypothesis to test. First, when we looked at migratoriness of different age classes, we found different results than in the previous field season. Individuals were more likely to migrate with increasing plumage categories. So this result is now based on 5 consecutive years instead of 1 year, so it looks to be pretty robust. And beyond the age of 4, there appears to be a gradual decrease in migratoriness from ages 5 to 7, with a few strangely migratory birds of the oldest age. Our interpretation as of now is that residual reproductive value is affecting male decisions, with senescence influencing the results. So we see these individuals, as we expected, migrating less and less with each passing age. But then when we get to these oldest males, these may be the ones who survived because they migrated, whereas there might be some birds right here that didn't migrate but also didn't make it. So these last two males are interesting because they may be the only 8-year-olds who survived, whereas the ones who stayed behind to maximize their residual reproductive value may have not made it. So in terms of how these birds make migratory decisions, this leaves us with a few main thoughts. Overall, none of our hypotheses on their own explained variation amongst these males, but results did lead us to a new hypothesis about the interaction between residual reproductive value and senescence in populations experiencing rainfall pressures. Now we're going to pull the lens back even further, while again focusing on this species that navigates extreme mid-elevation precipitation. We're going to learn about an ongoing analysis studying how climate might influence reproductive skew or degree of sexual selection among populations of this species that navigates competing pressures of sexual and natural selection. Again, we're working with the same species, the white-ruffed manakin. And this has been a time and field-intensive project, and I'm really excited to be working on it with Dr. Elsie Sjogren, a mentor of mine, who pioneered the work I'll talk about in this system, and obviously with my advisor, Dr. Alice Boyle, whose influence was really pivotal in the climate hypothesis we will discuss. We'll start by reviewing the concept of reproductive skew, which is important for the question we're asking. Reproductive skew is the degree of variation in reproductive success between individuals. When many males contribute to the next generation or there is a high male effective population size, we see low reproductive skew and weak or no sexual selection. So in other words, when many individuals get to be dads, we see many males contributing to the next generation and a high male effective population size. In populations with high reproductive skew, some individuals attract all the females, and there's a low male effective population size. This is a hallmark of strong sexual selection, and it's what we tend to see in birds like manakins. So in this study, we'll specifically be discussing the Z to A diversity ratio. Recall that birds' sex chromosomes are Z and W, so that males have 2 Z chromosomes and females have a Z and a W chromosome, and these here are autosomes. In the neutral expectation with even pairing of birds into male-female pairs, we can expect there will thus be 3 Z chromosomes for every pair of 2 autosomes in the population, leading to a Z to A diversity ratio of 0.75. This ratio is decreased when there is not an even pairing and some males hog all the reproductive success. So in these situations, there are fewer Z chromosomes compared to autosomes in the population, and we can pick that up through the Z to A diversity ratio. But within the field of ornithology, there's a gap in our understanding of how the Z to A diversity ratio is affected by reproductive skew, as compared to how it's affected by evolutionary events. Low Z to A diversity ratios can indicate low male effective population size, as I just described. But research on sex chromosome to autosomal diversity shows us that low Z to A diversity can also represent population bottlenecks, selective sweeps, and genetic drift, or a combination of those factors. So a number of evolutionary pressures can contribute to changes in Z to A diversity ratios. And ultimately, the theory doesn't quite make it clear what will define Z to A diversity ratios, nor has this been really explicitly tested empirically. So these gaps in knowledge and an interest in using Z to A diversity ratios in these populations led to our research question, which was, does climate or evolutionary history affect the Z to A diversity ratio or apparent reproductive skew? We're investigating this question through trips to sample white-ruffed manakins in Costa Rica and in Panama. So white-ruffed manakins are ideal for this question because they're under strong sexual selection as a species, but we can measure variation in the degree of sexual selection or reproductive skew, which is related to natural selective pressures such as rain, we think. They're also ideal because the evolutionary history of white-ruffed manakins is unclear, with ongoing discussion of two subspecies that can be distinguished based on their chin plumage, whether or not they have this black notch going into the white ruff. And depending on who you talk to, there are differences in behavior in these two subspecies. So these are on different sides of the continental divide in Costa Rica, which is impassable for these manakins. The continental divide is very high elevation, kind of like a paramo, and represents an inhospitable environment for the birds, so they don't cross over it. So by working throughout Costa Rica and Panama, we can select study sites with different climatic selective pressures and different degrees of convergence between species. We see higher mortality in wetter regions, which relates to our hypothesis that I'll discuss momentarily. Based on our understanding of climate, we propose the hypothesis that climate may influence Z to A diversity ratios in this species. Specifically, species exposed to consistent annual rains without the relief of a dry season may experience high male turnover, which means individual leading males have less of a chance to maintain dominance. Because more different males contribute to the next generation, we have higher Z to A diversity ratios when there's more consistent rainfall. So you can see this guy with the star right here is the star of the show and the popular one for now, but then if he dies due to the prolonged rainfall, somebody else will just take his place. So it's a way of getting a lot of dads in the population, even though this population is highly sexually selected. At the same time, the literature is full of lots of predictions about how Z to A diversity ratio should behave among populations of species subject to diverse selection pressures and demographic events, which these birds we think were. It is possible that one subspecies experienced maybe a population bottleneck or a selective sweep, lowering Z to A diversity ratios in some populations while allowing them to remain higher in other populations. Another possibility is that one subspecies started out as a small population and experienced genetic drift. So to test these hypotheses, we had to sample on either side of the continental divide in Costa Rica and Western Panama, where seasonality differs on either side of the divide and subspecies should differ as well in the place where they can't cross over. We also found sites in Panama where the subspecies converge along the continental divide, these purple and yellow dots here. We believe these populations, whatever the subspecies, involve birds that are able to mix together. These sites vary in the seasonality of their precipitation as well, with Panamanian sites chosen to have different seasonality than the Costa Rican samples that were chosen first, so there's really a variety in there. So recall the mechanism for the climate hypothesis is that we think that consistent rains without the relief of a dry season will lead to higher Z to A diversity ratios because of this more consistent rainfall. And if climate determines apparent reproductive skew, we anticipate that there will be higher Z to A diversity ratios in populations with little precipitation seasonality, or in other words, populations where there's not much of a difference between seasons. So we see that in these situations where there's not much difference between seasons, we see this higher Z to A diversity ratio, and when you see a difference between seasons, you have a lower Z to A diversity ratio. On the other hand, if evolutionary history determines apparent reproductive skew, we would expect that sites will have Z to A diversity ratios that correspond more to the evolutionary history of the subspecies present. So we might see lower Z to A diversity ratios on one side of the continental divide as compared to the other, and maybe medium values on the sites where the subspecies merge. Looking further into a metric called Tajima's D, we might see positive values above 0, where there was like a population contraction or a bottleneck, most likely on the Pacific side, which we think is a smaller metapopulation. We might also see negative values indicating purifying or positive selection. In any case, we expect that Z to A diversity ratios will relate to ancestry rather than climate. So this project involved a number of field seasons across Costa Rica and Panama, and the hard work of a lot of people and even more birds. There's a lot of packing and a lot of hiking. On the left, we have Adolfo, who served as a liaison to the Nobe Buble indigenous tribe in the most recent season, and helped us backpack into the mountains and negotiate work on a local family's land. These are some pictures from Elsie's field seasons in Costa Rica. And here are some more photos of our mist netting and banding adventures. So our idea of an easy place to mist net really changed over the course of the field seasons, as did our idea of a place that wasn't too muddy or wasn't too steep for putting our mist netting materials. So in the picture on the right, you can see Henry, who it's a very strange orientation, but that is an extremely steep slope that we were banding on. At the end of 4 field seasons, with the help of many fantastic technicians and more intermittent helpers, we ended up extracting DNA from hundreds of birds and chose the best 150 samples of genomic DNA for whole genome sequencing. Our earliest results come from an analysis using RADseq, which is a less comprehensive version of sequencing that still gave some really exciting results. We found that within the Costa Rican sites, higher Z-to-A diversity ratios, such as those on the Caribbean slope, are associated with lower seasonality, as predicted by the climate hypothesis, while lower Z-to-A diversity ratios are associated with higher seasonality. We didn't find strong relationships with the genetics, but we're going into more detail this time to investigate with a larger data set. So our real progress on this chapter continues in the form of me learning a lot of bioinformatic methods from Elsie, especially over the summer and fall. I finished extractions and sending DNA earlier this spring, and we've already received sequence data from Novogene. In fact, the data is being downloaded this week so we can work on this data set. That's going to allow us better splicing apart of the evolutionary influences and the subspecies influences. We're really excited about this project, and we hope you'll stay tuned for more details on the full data set. So when it comes to our final question of how climate or evolutionary history affect apparent reproductive skew, we don't have a lot of answers for you yet on this chapter, but we hope you're excited to find out and learn more about what the Z-to-A diversity ratio really means in birds. Zooming out to the much bigger picture here, I hope you've learned something today about new ways you hadn't thought about climate drivers in behavioral ecology. For example, rainfall affects not only behavior, but also species' timing of seasonal activities and their management of the trade-offs they face in terms of things like migration. Rainfall also appears to interact with sexual selection to influence animals' evolution. And finally, I want to emphasize that these results are exciting and that they are likely relevant to all endotherms, or organisms that generate heat internally. And they're not just relevant to our feathered friends that we're here to meet about today. So I want to thank many people and organizations who helped make this project possible. You can tell by how small the print is, how many people I had to thank. But I especially want to thank the Organization for Tropical Studies, Animal Behavior Society, and Wellesley College for funding supporting this project. And a huge thank you to AOS for believing in and supporting the Z-to-A diversity ratio project. You really helped make it possible. I have so many people to thank that I listed them here, but I want to thank my lab and members of my lab, especially Alice Boyle, my advisor. And these are some of the folks who were most pivotal to the field season. So I'll stop screen sharing now and answer any questions you might have.
All right. Thanks so much, Kristen, for a great talk. Great to hear about mannequins again. Always good to hear about mannequins. And if anyone has any questions, you can use the Q&A box. You can raise your hand, where I'm actually not sure where that hand raising button is, but if you find it, you can raise your hand, or message in the chat and I can unmute you if I see your message, or you can ask the question in the chat. So I will ask first from Kevin Bennett. Asks, did you measure temperature in the mid versus low elevation sites? This is talking about the white-collared manakin portion, where the higher elevation quartz actually colder.
No, that's a great question. And we didn't have temperature loggers in those locations. We do have data we could and have collected from from like La Selva and Puesto El Ceibo near where they were. So that's a good idea to look at for sure.
And then my question was sort of similar in that just thinking about other variables to test. I was thinking if I wouldn't I would be I wouldn't want to get up if I had like a really good seat. Is there a way to maybe through copulations know the value of a quart? Would a mannequin be less likely to migrate if it had a great quart?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I know anything. I don't know if anyone knows anything about what constitutes a great quart versus being a great mannequin and how to splice those apart. But I do
Mm,
think there are interesting follow-up questions about also how difficult it is to get your court back, or maybe if you're older, maybe you can get your court back more
mm,
easily, your
mhm.
display log back more easily. Um, so I don't know anything about what makes a great court, but I think that is a great question. Like, is is there something about where you're at that you want to stay?
And I'll just look at the various question places, just glancing. But I also wanted to ask that one that the manicus that was displaying during the rain in the rain, did it was that the only time it did that? Other times it rained, it did not do that?
Um, I didn't see it any other times. I think it was lucky that I was there that time because we would do behavioral observations all over. I didn't see a female there, which is one thing we've wondered about. She might have been there and I couldn't see her.
Mm.
But yeah, that was the only time I know of that particular guy just going crazy in the rain. Um,
And I was wondering, related to the display, do copulations change in rain or not rain? Is it less likely that they'll actually be successful?
I would, I mean, I would hazard a guess that there are just less copulations in rain because the females are probably back at their nests and not touring around. I know that depending on different areas and populations, you have different peaks in like the time of copulation. And I think like when I worked with lance-tailed manakins, it was like midday. And Kevin or someone probably knows more about what the manicus do at what times, but I would guess that the females are back at their nests, covering them up from the rain.
I don't see questions, but I'll ask one more in that case. I know you don't have the data set to do this, but I thought about if you combine the chapters, could individuals who displayed in the rain be more or less likely to migrate? Um, I was
So we
thinking,
don't actually know about the white collared mannequins and their
right.
migratory status.
Yeah,
We did
yeah.
kind of get a hint when we tried to find them at high elevations or at higher elevations and just couldn't find them where they were supposed to be. We started to wonder, do they migrate? And from talking to locals, it sounds like there may be migratory behavior. So that is a question of whether something's happening in Manicus that just nobody's had a chance to look at yet.
All right, guys. Well, if that, oh, I am sorry, I missed some Q&A. I apologize. So Sophia Wolf asks, could you explain again why the high elevation sites are more desirable?
Oh, so it's not so much that the higher elevation sites are more desirable, but it is that they breed at higher elevations. So they breed at those middle elevations. And so everybody is breeding there, but some individuals go downhill just to get away from the rain, or maybe for additional reasons that we're trying to learn about. But yeah, I should have been clear that the breeding just happens at those middle elevations, and if you can avoid migrating, that's generally the thing you want to do because it's a stressor.
And Catherine Locke asks, for chapter 2, you had two hypotheses that predicted opposite relationships between display rate and migratoriness. But what you found was more like a cloud of points. What if both pressures exist and balance each other out? Yeah. Do you have a way to test that?
Yeah, that's a great point for my discussion section because that's something we've been talking about. And I think that's the importance of being able to test several alternative hypotheses, is trying to tease apart and not just look at one at a time, but trying to tease apart what we might see if we look at multiple. So we do have hints here, and in the individual predictions, we have hints that there is a tendency to migrate more if you've displayed more on the individual level. If you look at what happens to just specific mannequins. And you also see that there are those individuals who seem to survive till the very end, which we kind of thought was a hint at the quality hypothesis. So I think it's reasonable to say that there are multiple factors at play. It's just a matter of which ones are strongest, and the strongest signal we got was the reproductive value one.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending, everybody who asked questions. Thank you to any mannequin people in the audience. I think we got some mannequinologists here in the audience. And so thanks, everybody, for being here. Ah, I'm sorry, I missed that. Thank you. Missed one more question in the chat from Raven. Are birds, the birds that breed at relatively lower elevations in mid-altitude regions, are they more likely to be reproductively successful?
I don't know the answer to that. Is this for the Manicus, or I'm not sure which one she's referring to, but I think we don't know about reproductive success in these populations. That's something it would be great if somebody addressed.
Yeah, maybe the core peepo section, but
Yeah, so the ones who are more successful are the ones who don't migrate at all and stay behind, stay at middle elevations. But we just know more about whether they're popular with females. We don't actually know siring success.
okay, so I think now I don't think I've missed any questions. But thank you everyone again for being here, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Have a great week. Bye, Kristen. Thanks so much.